Hello everyone, Dr. Feist here, and I am finishing up number 9, part 9 of a series of videos on Does Moral Philosophy Rest on a Mistake? The great 1912 paper by H.A. Prichard. And again, last one. So if you haven't seen any of the previous videos, go check them out, because in this one I'm just tying some things together and saying goodbye to Prichard for now. Well, in our previous discussion, Prichard went off in video number 8. He was comparing epistemology of mathematics and ethics, and he used it as epistemology of mathematics as sort of a lead-in to how he thinks about what moral philosophy really is. So and he thinks there's 2 results, but before we get to those results, I just want to say that when we say, is the state of knowing 2 plus 2 is equal to 4 really knowledge, Prichard has concluded that that is an illegitimate question. Now, of course, once you shift, as we saw in the previous video, once you shift from a state of knowledge or where you know something to where you think you believe it, psychologically, yeah, you can doubt this. You doubt it by shifting the grounds. Now, what do you do when you fall into this doubt about 2 plus 2 is equal to 4? The remedy is you do the sum over again. That's what Prichard says. You have to do this sum over again because there's no external argument. We've looked at the whole epistemology question about going outside and looking for some criterion or whatever. He thinks that's a big mistake. It's going to generate a regress. It's a confusion. Don't do it. It's not going to work. Now back to moral philosophy. Prichard says the situation is more or less like this, and he tells us a little story. Think about how we are in the world, how we actually are as creatures. We live, we learn, we're educated, we're increasingly sensitized. Just as a child is sensitized to mathematics, you get more and more sensitive to propositions like 2 plus 2 is equal to 4 through education. You're not born knowing them. You eventually reach them through some kind of educational learning process, and then eventually you grasp them. 2 plus 2 is 4. You're not counting trucks anymore. You're not counting sleeps. How we are in the world, how does this work? Well, he says you start off with this non-reflective consciousness. We've seen that before. Go back to video 8. This non-reflective consciousness, I'm going to just abbreviate this as NRC. So we're in the world in our non-reflective consciousness, and we find ourselves in various situations. S. What happens? Well, basically, in this non-reflective consciousness mode, plus S, in other words, as you engage with the world, what do you get? You eventually get this special mental state, this immediate awareness of obligations. You don't get this from day one. You're not born with this. This is a product. Just like you were not born knowing 2 plus 2 is equal to 4, it is ultimately a product that you come to see. All right, so you get this little, which I've labeled by an asterisk here, this immediate awareness of obligations. So, in that sense, you have an unquestioning confidence in them. We've seen this, but the clash of desires and this immediate awareness, that gives rise to doubt. You're now in a new state. You're doubting your obligations, and then you demand proofs. That's illegitimate. So this demanding of proofs for the initially acquired obligations through the interaction of the non-reflective consciousness and situations, let's call that demand, illegitimate as it is, let's call that gamma. All right, so we've gone through this little narrative that we've seen Prichard build up. So the 2 results of all this, if moral philosophy, using the Greek symbol for philosophy here, if moral philosophy answers, if it is to answer this demand gamma, then there's no such thing as moral philosophy. It's a complete mistake, right? So this attempt to try, think about what he's really saying here, is this whole attempt to ground obligations, to say, why should you do well to make happy or whatever, all that stuff, or raise the general level of happiness in society or whatever, those don't ground obligations. And they're illegitimate demands. But if you equate moral philosophy with the answering of an illegitimate demand, moral philosophy is ultimately vacuous. You have to, Prichard says, realize that moral obligations are not found in some sort of roundabout way. That's where they come from. They are ultimately self-evident, an immediate awareness of obligation, hence the intuition. Prichard is well-known as an intuitionist. So moral philosophy really is just this recognition of the self-evidence of obligations, virtues, and dispositions. This is what, these things here, this is moral knowledge. It's narrow. Yeah, there's actually not much moral knowledge, but there's enough of it, and it is very important. So moral knowledge is a small set of things that we come to immediately see, and these kinds of things. But it is important because it's heavily influential. You live your life basically either resisting or conforming or whatever to this small set of things that Prichard calls moral knowledge, positive knowledge. This is real knowledge. Just like knowing 2 + 2 = 4, that's real knowledge. All right, so that's your first result, is that moral philosophy is not this attempt to justify, it's this attempt to recognize. And again, if you doubt, as we talked a little bit about here, if you come to this, you remedy, you do the situation again. Well, Prichard's more or less reiterating that. If you really doubt your obligations, right? If you get to this point, for whatever reason you're doubting, you must retrieve the origination of them. In other words, you somehow put yourself back in this state of the non-reflective consciousness engaging in situations. So the non-reflective consciousness engaging in situations, you do it for real, like you actually go and you put yourself in there, and you can basically reproduce this origination of an immediate awareness of obligation. So that's what I mean by for real, you actually do it. Or, as Prichard says, if your imagination is strong enough, then you can simply duplicate the experience that way by remembering and then retrieving it, so you have this immediate awareness of obligation. Well, that brings us to the end. So Prichard's story is trying to say, does moral philosophy rest on a mistake? Not necessarily. It can, if you think moral philosophy is the attempt to justify, prove things that really aren't in need of proof and can't be proven. You've gone awry if you try to prove these things. Moral philosophy is actually a very small domain of positive knowledge. But the key takeaway is that it's extremely important knowledge because, frankly, it's going to affect how you live your entire life. Thank you.